Okay, so I want to talk about a recent episode on I Am Athlete podcast. The crew was interviewing Joe Budden, and they was basically talking about Joe Budden, and the conversation and interview got kind of in a weird place personally for me when they started talking about Joe Budden as far as him collaborating or doing anything in the future with his former colleagues Rory and Mal, and basically the I Am Athlete podcast members sort of kind of beat around the bush of Brandon Marshall's struggles with his former colleagues of I Am Athlete podcast. And the reason why I say it's so weird because I felt like a lot of people were inputting in a situation that they were, they don't know the ins and outs about, or they wasn't with that initial group. And that initial group was Fred Taylor, Crowder, you guys, I butcher people's names on a regular basis, and Ryan Clark. I hope they don't take it personal, but I do butcher people's names. And I felt like Pac-Man Jones, as well as the other members of that podcast, was inputting and basically beating around the bush till finally the producer of I Am Athlete podcast said out loud in the background, look, if y'all want to talk about the Pivot podcast, let's talk about it. Quit beating around the bush. Just tell your side of the story, and that's it. And it got a notch a little bit better, but I felt like Brandon Marshall, as well as Pac-Man Jones and others, were still kind of sort of beating around the bush. They was adding some little tidbits here and there. They got a little bit stronger with their thoughts and opinions about the Pivot podcast, but they were still pretty much beating around the bush. Now, here's my thing with the Pivot podcast and the I Am Athlete podcast and why they broke up and they all went their separate ways. Brandon Marshall talked about this in a recent interview, as well as Fred Taylor, Crowder, and I believe Ryan Clark mentioned this on social media about the breakup with I Am Athlete. It didn't end on a good note. I felt like I don't care if you're a fan of the I Am Athlete podcast or the Pivot podcast, I don't care who you subscribe to, I feel like both sides can sort of kind of handle it the wrong way. They allowed their emotions and feelings to take over and attack each other personally. And I've heard this interview from both sides. And basically what I gathered was Brandon Marshall basically came up to Fred Taylor, Crowder, as well as Ryan Clark, and basically gave them a proposal. Okay, and he said you guys can either go one or two ways. You can either make a salary or per episode how much you're going to make, but you don't really own or have any ownership or any responsibilities or obligations to I Am Athlete. Or if you're interested in becoming an owner, look, we're going to have some money up front, as well as as well as future billing issues with the I Am Athlete podcast. Now, it does mean you're going to get a great return in if it's successful. But if the I Am Athlete podcast struggled and it didn't do the numbers that right now is doing, then as an owner, you're responsible for the losses, okay? And you're also going to be responsible for salaries and the crew and just things of that nature. And Fred Taylor didn't want to become a member, well, an owner. He wanted to just be just paid per episode, which is nothing wrong with that. Okay. And I felt like the real reason why Fred Taylor went that way was, a lot of people don't really know this, but Fred Taylor has been involved in some bad investment deals. And he's just been stung by a lot of these bad investment deals that just did not pan out for him. And he lost a lot of money. He also lost a lot of, he lost a lot of money in these bad business deals, and he lost a lot of faith in them. So he didn't want to go plunge into something that, yes, he was offered to be on the podcast, but I don't think Fred Taylor was in lining as far as doing a podcast on that magnitude. He didn't mind going in and chopping it up and talking about football stories or doing interviews like that. But as far as owning something, and what if it fails? Everyone's talking about, well, you should think about what this could do and catapult you as far as financially, as far as influence-wise on social media. Fred Taylor is not that type of individual that is a flashy type of individual that wants a lot of clout on social media. He just wants to just do a podcast, interview, talk about some football stories, and he's 88 out the gate. Okay. With Crowder, he was sort of in between, but he definitely wanted ownership of I Am Athlete, but he wanted ownership on his terms. Now, he didn't mind paying the upfront starting fee, but what he had issues with Brandon Marshall was the rest of the fees, the maintenance and things of that nature of running this type of business. He didn't want to, split that bill or that fee. So he was pretty much out on it. Plus, he said in a recent interview that he felt like him and Brandon Marshall were on like two different wavelengths. That he felt like, Brandon Marshall wanted to venture out and do X, Y, and Z, and he wanted to venture out and do A, B, and C with this podcast. So the future looked kind of murky to him, and what Brandon Marshall wanted to do wasn't necessarily what he wanted to do with the podcast. Now, I know a lot of people say, and I've heard a lot of people say this in the comment section as well as videos. Look, these are multi-millionaires. I mean, why are they worried or crying about taking a loss? If anything, they would have took a loss or buying into something, and you're going to have to fork over $200,000 to $300,000. Okay, $100K plus. Why would multimillionaires like on that magnitude will be concerned about splitting the bill? Because when you think about it, I mean, that's not a lot of money to them. That's a lot of money for you and I, but that's not a lot of money for them. And I felt like Fred Taylor, with his, he tried the investment route and it didn't pan out. With Crowder, he didn't mind the initial startup fee, but he didn't want to dive into the other fees and taking a chance or taking a risk on something that is not matching up with his dreams and goals of where he wants this podcast to lead to. Now with Ryan Clark, that's where it got kind of sad, got kind of weird. It done gotten so personal between those two individuals that they're no longer speaking to one another. All right, and that's a crying shame, but it is what it is. And I remember not Ryan Clark, but Brandon Marshall talking about how it's gotten so petty and gotten so personal between the two that they've been flagging a lot. And when I mean they, the Pivot, well, more so maybe Ryan Clark or maybe the whole Pivot crew, is flagging a lot of I Am Athlete's video. And I thought that was, puzzling and confused. But Ryan Clark felt like they should all have the same dreams and the same goals as far as the future of the I Am Athlete podcast. And then it really soured when they found out that Brandon Marshall trademarked the name and they don't have a stake in the trademark. Now, hindsight being 50-50, I felt like if all of them were owners, I felt like as far as the trademark situation, that could have been resolved by them, by Brandon Marshall allowing the owners to also own the name and the trademark of I Am Athlete. But I felt like it was like between these individuals, it was the trust deteriorated between both parties, both sides. Fred Taylor left a sour taste in Brandon Marshall's mouth. Now he claims he's cool with them, but it's not a good look when you schedule a meeting for Fred Taylor to talk about his future as far as ownership of I Am Athlete's podcast. You schedule this meeting and Fred Taylor does a no-call, no-show. Now, they also said he has a history of doing that, all right? So, I felt like the dynamic between Fred Taylor and Brandon Marshall, I feel like they're cool, but that they're going to have to gain each other's trust on that level, however they want to do it. I feel like Crowder is likewise, but I feel like he's sort of okay with it because when you think about it, they all got what they wanted. Brandon Marshall wanted I Am Athlete to be in a different place, in a different stratosphere, and he has control and leverage to do it. Ryan Clark, Crowder, and Fred Taylor, they're doing the Pivot podcast, and everything's hunky-dory over there. But I also want to say, and this part in the video, I want to really put this out for us as African Americans. I feel like there are not a lot of podcasts that are founded and created by African Americans. Okay, yes, there's African Americans hosting it. There are African Americans in interviews who they interview, but there's not a lot of media groups, particularly in the podcast space, that is owned 100% by African Americans. Now, I know a lot of nationalities are going to look at this and say, well, what difference does it make? It means a lot of difference. It means a big difference because a lot of the topics, particularly in the sports world, are African American topics. Serena Williams, that's an African American topic. Now, everyone can gravitate to it and pull from that interview. From a Serena Williams story, but there's not a lot of podcasts that are owned by African Americans, and we own Lock, Stock, and Barrel, the podcast. For every one Joe Button, there's hundreds and thousands of other podcasts that are not owned by an African American. Same could be said for the Pivot. Same could be said for I Am Athlete. And I feel like the space that we are in, I feel like now more than ever, African Americans who own these podcasts, the listeners who are African American, on social media, we have an influence. I feel like now more than ever, we should promote anything that's African American owned. It is so important, okay? If we start sharing and collaborating and supporting African American talent, African American owned podcasts, we can change the landscape as far as media goes, okay? 95% of sports media stories involve African Americans. But yet, the media groups, the podcasts, as well as these networks, is not 90%. Okay? It's 95% of these media groups, of these podcasts, of these networks are owned by someone who is not African American. And it's so important for us to have this lane and to have this space. But I feel like at the end of the day, with the I Am Athlete and the Pivot podcast, I feel like both sides handled it the wrong way. I think a lot of them they put too much feelings and emotions in it. And I feel like there's a lot of dishonesty, that there's, both sides don't trust one another. But I feel like ultimately, when cooler heads are prevailed, they're going to one day talk about it, maybe do a podcast on it, have a collaboration with the I Am Athlete and the Pivot podcast, doing an interview on it, telling each other's side of the stories in the same room, that can mend and heal fences, heal a lot of mental scars, and hopefully that gets done. Now with Ocho, and I want to talk about Ocho real fast, real quick. Brandon Marshall really didn't say too much about Ocho. I don't know. There's probably an issue with him and Ocho. It's probably not that deep. It's not that serious. But Ocho has always been a person that wants to be in and out of a situation. He doesn't want to be stuck into something where he's held liable, or he has obligations and responsibilities to build something. I feel like Ocho is great when you just add him in onto something that's already has a good foundation, that has the right tools in place to flourish. All right. And, I can see a situation where he can bounce from both podcasts, the Pivot podcast as well as I Am Athlete. And he's cool with that. But he really didn't go into no full details about Ocho. But I feel like they're cool, but I don't think they're that tight. I don't think they were that tight in the first place. I feel like Ocho, the reason why he was on a lot of the I Am Athlete podcast was because of Ryan Clark, Fred Taylor, and Crowder. I feel like because of his relationship with those individuals, as well as his relationship with the people that are working for the I Am Athlete podcast. I'm not saying him and Brandon Marshall didn't have a relationship, but I feel like those guys knew him better than Brandon Marshall. And, he didn't really go into full details about Ocho. But like I said, I feel like both sides, how they handled the situation was wrong. And that's why I always say, and another thing is, I felt like both sides were handling situations by themselves instead of allowing their lawyers, their attorneys to handle the business end, and allowing Fred Taylor and Brandon Marshall and Ryan Clark and Ocho, Pac-Man, all of them, they should handle the brotherhood, the friendship. I think, it was like a mixed pot of gumbo. The friendship, the business, the contracts, the ownership. I think they was all handling it together on their own. And I think that was a recipe for disaster. But guys, tell me what you think. Rate, comment, subscribe. I will see you guys in the next video. Deuces.